Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the book of Isaiah. In these chapters that we're going to read today, chapters 12 to 17, we'll see the beginning of God promising to bring destruction against all the nations that are not faithful to him. But before that, we're going to see a little song of praise for what God is going to do for Israel. That's what's happening here in chapter 12. Isaiah writes in verse 2, he says, "Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. For the Lord Jehovah is my strength and my song. He also has become my salvation." So you see, guys, Isaiah knows that God is angry and that God is getting ready to issue punishment for their sins, the sins of his people. But what he also realized is that he could be saved by accepting God's offer of salvation. And that's obviously what Isaiah does. So after that song of praise, we get a much darker passage here from really the next 11 chapters, even though we're only reading to chapter 17 today. And when we look at chapter 13, we see Isaiah prophesying of the destruction of Babylon. Now, as for the actual destruction that he's talking about now, it's hard to be completely sure like which time period this was, because Babylon rose and fell a few different times in the ancient world, but it would be ultimately destroyed, because if you look around the world today, there's no place called Babylon, so it does not exist. But Babylon was one of the old world powers. And by the way, in the last days, think during the 7 years of tribulation after the rapture, Babylon will actually be rebuilt and will then face its judgment from God. But back to chapter 13, Babylon is the kingdom where Nebuchadnezzar was from. And you may remember Nebuchadnezzar. Hopefully you do, and maybe not, okay? That's from the story of Daniel and the lion's den. And if you don't remember that, you can look at the book of Daniel, or just keep the story in mind when we eventually get there in our reading plan in a few months. But anyway, God says that he's going to judge Babylon. And what was the reason? For their pride. Verse 19 says, "Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees, excellency shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." God is going to utterly destroy Babylon because of their pride. So then when we see in chapter 14 that Israel is going to be restored and the king of Babylon will face judgment. And pay attention, though, who he says the king of Babylon is. He's talking about Satan, the devil. Verse 12 says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down the ground, which didst weaken the nation?" So remember, the devil was originally an angel, okay? Lucifer, Satan. He was originally an angel, but he rebelled against God and became his adversary, his number one enemy. And you can see here in this chapter that the devil makes claims on things that he's going to do or try to do, and then the Lord responds at the end. So the devil prospered for a while and won a few battles on earth, but he is not going to win the war. He's going to win lots of battles because he is he's running wild in our world today. And if you're looking for him, he's easy to find. He's easy to spot in the world today. And he's winning lots of battles, but he's not going to win the war. God is going to completely destroy him and Babylon, which is known as his kingdom. So the chapter wraps up with God promising to judge Assyria and the Philistines. Now remember, the Philistines are one of Israel's oldest enemies. And if they sound really familiar and you don't know why, remember David, Goliath, the giant. Goliath was fighting with the Philistines. He was a Philistine. And so that's who David was fighting. And they've tormented God's people for a long time, but that too is going to come to an end. Chapter 15, he talks about the kingdom of Moab. Moab should have been Israel's friends and allies because they were actually related. They were descendants of Lot. Remember Lot, the nephew of Abraham. But they were one of Israel's greatest tormentors and enemies. They rejected God and they worshipped idols. Now Moab would be destroyed by the Assyrians, as we see here in these chapters. And unlike Judah, they would receive no deliverance from the Lord. No one will survive. And if you look at verse 9, he says, "For the waters of Demon shall be full of blood, for I will bring death upon Damon, lions upon him that escapeth Moab, and upon the remnant of the land." They've been sinning and running from God for quite some time, and now it's going to be the time to pay for it. So if you remember, God has said that he was going to establish his kingdom through Abraham and through his children. So every time God brings judgment on them, and he does it time and time again. And as we read through this Old Testament, we're going to see God's people following him, and then God's people not following him and worshiping false gods and idols and all these things, and they're going to be judged. But every time they're judged, God never wipes them out completely. He always leaves a remnant so that he can keep his promise that he made way back with Abraham in Genesis. So he keeps the remnant alive, but Moab, he does not do that for, because they have neglected him, they have rejected him, and they are not his chosen people. They are related to them, but they are not a part of the promise of Abraham. So in chapter 16, we can see that they're going to send lambs to the ruler of the land in hopes of finding asylum in Jerusalem, but it's not going to work. God is angry with Moab, and we see why in chapter 6. We've heard of the pride of, not chapter 6, sorry, in chapter 16. We have heard of the pride, this is verse, sorry, let me clarify. This is chapter 16, verse 6. We have heard of the pride of Moab. He's very proud, even of his haughtiness, and his pride and his wrath, but his lies shall not be so. So remember, pride comes before the fall, and this nation of Moab was so proud and so sure that they did not need God, but they were wrong, and that's why they were destroyed. And I want you to see through that also in chapter 16. We have another prophecy of Christ. It actually says in verse 5 that in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness. So obviously that is talking about Jesus, who is going to one day return, and he's going to sit in the temple and rule the world, really, from the throne of David. So the last chapter for today is number 17. And this one would be a prophecy against Damascus, which was a major city in Aram, or modern day Syria. Because the people of Israel, referred to as Ephraim here in verse 3. So if you're a little confused at who it's talking about, when he says Ephraim, Ephraim was one of Joseph's sons, his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. And so they are a part of the children of Israel. And so they had formed an alliance with Damascus to try and defeat the Assyrians instead of just trusting in the Lord, and they're going to face judgment for it. So remember, the people of Israel, they've neglected God, and they have the opportunity, or they have the opportunity to trust him when these other nations are going to try to invade them and try to come in and kill them. And so what do? Do they turn to God? No, they turned to Damascus, which was another superpower in the land. So you can see how in the human strength, the human mind, the human strength, our fleshly knowledge, it would make sense. Hey, this is a powerful group of people. We can make an alliance with them, and they will help us win this battle. But that's not what God wanted them to do. He wanted to trust fully in him, and they had forgotten the Lord. And as we read through the Old Testament, you'll see a lot of references of times when they're faithful to God and when they've forgotten him. When they forget God, they always face judgment. And that's what's happening here in these chapters. These evil nations whose God isn't the Lord are going to be judged for it. Now, some people like to push Bible passages into where they don't fit. And as an American, God is not talking to the United States of America here. So let's be clear right there. But we can learn something from this. These nations rejected the Lord, and they refused to serve him as their God. They were destroyed because of it, and they face his judgment. And I pray that our nation does return to the Lord, or come to the Lord, and that we do start to seek his will for every aspect of our lives. And the way that starts is one person at a time. If we can devote our lives to God, to the Lord, and start trusting in him in everything that we're going through, then we can avoid this harsh judgment. And God's people here are going to be judged just like everybody else in this passage in Isaiah. That's what Isaiah is telling them. All these other nations that have neglected God, it looks like they're okay because God hasn't judged them yet. They're going to be judged. And so are God's people that have turned away from him. And so that's all for today. That's all for Isaiah's chapters 12 to 17. And we will pick this up again tomorrow in Matthew chapter 5 through 6.